Hello, my name is Kiana Johnson, and today I am going to be walking through the A Home Away from Home activity. So, I would start out with a discussion question. This question would be, what do we know about polar bears? Being as the focus of this activity is on polar bears, I want the students to have, or to get their brains just thinking about polar bears. And so I would have them either pair up or work at their table, depending on the organization of the room. I'd give them 1 to 2 minutes to talk amongst themselves and come up with any kinds of ideas that they have from any kind of previous knowledge that they have. Afterwards, we would go around group to group and they would share one thing at a time. I would write it on the board and make a list. And then we need to go into just a very short discussion on that. After that, we would go to a video. It's a short 3 or 4 minute long video put out by National Geographic. That is just Polar Bears 101. It talks about what polar bears are, where they live, why they live there, some adaptations that they have, what they eat, how many babies they have. And so I just thought this would be a really good way, a quick way, and a nice visual way to learn a lot in a short amount of time. After that, we would have just a little bit more discussion on their habitat. So we could talk about the fact that they are Arctic animals. I could show them where that Arctic region is. I provided a map here. And I liked this one because it also labeled the countries that are part of that Arctic region. And this is a different view than most students would have seen of the world, and so I always think it's a good idea to show those different perspectives as well. So then we would go on and talk about how they spend most of their time, about 90% of their time, on the floating ice within this Arctic region, and only about 10% on the land that is there. Then we could talk a little bit about what polar bears do. They are very active animals and they spend a lot of time and energy hunting and foraging for their food. They're big animals, so they need to eat a lot to sustain themselves. And so in hunting for their food, they can travel thousands of miles on that ice, and they usually have to follow the migrations of their prey. And their favorite meal are ringed and bearded seals. So this would lead into another discussion question of what adaptations do polar bears have for living in the Arctic? And so this could cover things like the color of their fur. It's white, it reflects the sun, they blend into their environment. They could talk about the fact that they have claws and some extra grippiness on the pads of their feet so that they don't slip and fall on all the ice that they walk on. The fact that they have 1 to 2 cubs normally because they can't provide food for more than that. It could go in all sorts of directions. So I would have them think pair and share again. So they would either pair up with someone next to them or talk at their table. They have 1 to 2 minutes to do this, and then we would discuss as a class, and I would list their answers out on the board. After that, we could talk just a little bit about mating. The fact that females become pregnant in the fall and the winter seasons, and when they do so, they build their nests or their dens in the snow drifts, so the big piles of snow, or directly on the ice. And so we can move on to talk a little bit about the food that they eat. They feed most heavily in the spring and the summer, and then lighter in the winter and the fall. They do enjoy their seals. That is their primary source of food because the seals have that really thick blubber layer, and so that is full of fat, which contains a lot of energy and can sustain the polar bears for a long amount of time. But they are also opportunistic feeders, meaning if nature provides them an opportunity to eat something else, they will probably take it. And so this could include, but is not limited to, beluga whales, walruses, fish, and then they've also been known to hunt down caribou. And so that ice that they live on because of global warming and rising temperatures, that is resulting in a dramatic decline of Arctic sea ice. And so remember that they spent 90% of their time on that floating sea ice. And so with the decline of that ice, it also decreases the ability of the polar bears to hunt their seals, which is their primary food source. And so I also provided a link here to a video by NASA that shows the changes of Arctic sea ice over time, and then over a longer length of time it shows the decrease in sea ice, but it also shows the seasonal fluctuations between summer and winter. So I thought it was a good video. It's about 2 or 3 minutes long, so it's not very long. And it could mean more to the students to see that image rather than just hear me talk about the decline of sea ice. And so after that, we could talk about the fact that in 2008, polar bears were listed as a threatened species with the Endangered Species Act, primarily because of that sea ice decline. But currently, they are listed as a vulnerable species. And so this would lead into another discussion question, kind of changing their gear a little bit. So this would be, what do you think zoos do to keep their polar bears healthy? So this is changing their mindset from polar bears living in the wild to polar bears living in captivity. And so we would do the same activity, the think, pair, share, pair up, talk amongst the table, share out their ideas. I would list them on the board, and then we would continue on. And then as we continue on, I would have them think about the differences between the Arctic to Phoenix, Arizona. And I would hope that some students would realize the dramatic differences, but the fact that we could discuss it quickly would help reassure me that everyone can start out or learn the same information. So we would talk about the climatic differences, the fact that one is primarily frozen and really cold for most of the year, and the other is mostly desert and is very hot. So this would lead up to the activity, and the activity would be to design a polar bear enclosure that is located in Phoenix, Arizona. And so I created a little Word document with some instructions, and so their task is to, they would pair up or get in groups depending on the class size and whatnot, but they would need to design a polar bear enclosure at a zoo located in Phoenix, Arizona. They would have unlimited funding, and they can decide how big or how small they want their enclosure to be. But they have to remember that the public, so the people in Arizona, really do want to see these polar bears. So they need to make sure that they include viewing sites, but then also allow polar bears extra space and some relaxing space that they can sleep in and be away from people. So this would primarily occur in 3 steps. So the first step would be talking amongst their group, brainstorming ideas, writing it on paper, and then talking with me, making sure that they hit on all their requirements. And their requirements would be to make sure that their enclosure has a sleeping place, a hiding place or a den for solitude, a pool for them to swim in, a drinking water source, food, exercise space, play opportunities, and it must look like their natural environment. And then they would also have to consider things like the temperature differences, humidity levels, the floor and ground coverings, light intensity, water, their food and the diet that they're used to, if there should be any plant life around, and then how they can maintain this. So after they have brainstormed all that and talked with me, I would give them their poster and let them have ample access to craft supplies. So that could be crayons, colored pencils, markers, anything else that they can use on a poster. And so they would draw this out or color this out, I guess. on that poster, but then they would also need to write out on a sheet of paper why they're making these decisions and changes and why this is beneficial to the polar bears, and then what considerations they took into account. After that, we would have a poster presentation in which each group would have as long as they need, but capping it out at like 10 minutes. I would expect it to be about 5 minutes per group. They would talk about their enclosure that they made, answer any questions, and talk about the favorite part of their enclosure and the hardest part for them to think about. And then I would display them all on a wall. After their poster presentation, I would hang them up in the room, and then we would have a nice discussion. And so these would be the main discussion questions I would bring up. So the challenges of raising a polar bear in captivity, and then we would talk about the potential solutions to those challenges. After that, we could talk about specifically why the needs of a captive polar bear are different than of a wild polar bear. And then we would talk about the ideas they came up with of what zookeepers do or can do to keep their polar bears happy and healthy. And then branching it out to a wider range of animals, we could talk about captive animals in general. So do all animals have these struggles? Do they all have different needs in captivity and in the wild? And how do zookeepers address this? After, well, I guess not after that, but in terms of my specifications, I would gear this at 6th or 7th graders, and I would request about 2 class periods, 2 50-minute class periods. The information portion would probably take about 25 to 30 minutes, and then they would have the rest of the class to work with their group on their poster. And then I would have them give them about half of that next class to finish up their poster. And then save about 20 to 30 minutes for presentations, and then the rest of the time for the discussion questions. The materials we would need are paper, poster board, drawing utensils, coloring utensils, and then a computer would be optional. I would suggest this in case they have any extra questions. They can look it up on the internet or ask the teacher, but rather than using like a cell phone, I would rather have them use a laptop or desktop. And then the main objectives for this activity are to learn about the lives of polar bears, identify problems for an animal that's no longer in its natural environment, compare ways an animal needs are met in captivity versus in the wild, and then design and create a safe enclosure for a pair of polar bears living in Phoenix, Arizona at a zoo. And then if we had funding, some extensions would be to visit a zoo on a field trip and analyze that current enclosure of the polar bear. Does it meet the polar bear's needs? What can be improved? What's good? That would all be an interesting discussion. And then we could even talk with that zoo about the changes we could suggest or the beneficial things that they have. Additionally, or separately, we could look up different mission statements of zoos, talk about the pros and the cons of captivity in general. Is it good to have animals in enclosures, or should they always be in the natural environment? And then we could talk about what kinds of animals are in zoos, what have we seen in zoos before, and then from those animals we could talk about what the natural state or what the state of their natural habitats are, and then if there are any conservation efforts being done in their natural environments. And so I think this is a really cool activity, and there's a lot to learn from, and there's a lot you can do with this, so I look forward to trying and using this in my future classroom. Thank you.